Hello there and good morning. It is 7 a.m. It's time for a fair deal for people on the front line. That's the message this morning from the new head of the TUC, who's calling for an urgent meeting with the Prime Minister to try and break the deadlock of the public sector strikes. We'll be joined by Paul Novak in just a minute. Plus, Rishi Sunak's plan for all pupils to study maths until the age of 18. And the pressure on the NHS continues to grow. We'll be joined by Labour's Rosanna Allen Khan, and we'll speak to one of the NHS leaders warning that they've never been more concerned about the standards of acute care in our hospitals. It is Wednesday, the 4th of January. The new head of the TUC calls for an urgent meeting with Rishi Sunak in a bid to end the wave of public sector strikes.
Significant disruption to train services again today as railway workers continue their strike action. I'll have the latest from the picket line here at Euston.
Compulsory maths until 18 as the Prime Minister sets out his priorities for the year ahead. Health leaders warn the NHS is on a knife edge as the government insists it has the money it needs to cope this winter. Food price inflation hits a record high in December, putting more pressure on struggling households. In the United States, the Republican leader Kevin McCarthy repeatedly fails in his bid to be elected the new Speaker of the House of Representatives. And the power of touch, a unique London exhibition to mark World Braille Day opens, and we'll be speaking to the artists behind it.
You know it's not the same as it was, as it was, as it was.
Hitting all the right notes, UK artists take a clean sweep of the top 10 singles of 2022 as streaming takes the industry to new levels. Hello and thanks for joining us. The new head of the TUC is calling for an urgent meeting with the Prime Minister this morning in a bid to try and resolve the continuing wave of industrial action across the country. Significant disruption is expected on the rail network again today as the RMT continues its strike with just a fraction of the normal number of trains expected to run. And the walkouts look set to continue throughout the month, with nurses and paramedics also due to strike again. Well, let's bring in our Sabah Chowdhury, who's joining us now from Euston Station in London. Good morning to you, Sabah. So the strikes continue for a second day.
Good morning. Well, it's very quiet here at Euston train station this morning. Around half of the trains aren't operating and the majority of services have been impacted. And this is because of the strike action. The RMT union have staged 2 48-hour strikes this week. So from yesterday and today and Friday to Saturday. And that's across England, Scotland and Wales this week. And ultimately, it all boils down to the long-standing disputes between the unions and the government and the rail companies. It's about pay, it's about job security, and it's also about changes to terms and conditions. Now, the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper, has said that I'd rather get these guys off the picket line and bring them to the negotiating table. Let's talk over there. But the RMT leader, Mick Lynch, who is on the picket line just behind us, he isn't having any of it. He's told Sky News that the government keep talking about facilitating an agreement, but when it actually comes down to it, nothing tangible, he said, has been agreed, and that the last time they met was on December the 15th, and that government and rail companies failed to come to the negotiating table over the Christmas period. And if they had, these strikes could have been avoided. Now, the state-run company Network Rail have said that a deal is in touching distance, but whether that will be the case, I'm sure we'll find out by next week at the earliest.
OK, Sabah, for now, Euston, thank you for that. Let's take a quick look at the number of strikes that are taking place this month. And as Sabah was saying, rail strikes continue today until Friday, with workers on the Elizabeth line set to strike on Saturday. Some London bus drivers are striking today and on 6 other days this month. Highway workers and driving examiners will be on strike this week too. Paramedics are going to walk out on the 11th and 23rd, and nurses will strike again on the 18th and 19th of January. Pleased to say the General Secretary of the TUC, Paul Novak, joins us now. Paul, good morning to you. Thanks for being with us this morning. Now, you've talked about a fair deal for workers. The nurses are asking for 5% above RPI inflation. Is that a fair deal, considering the pay restraints that the government must have in place?
Well, listen, we've got 133,000 vacancies in our NHS at the moment. We've got a staffing crisis, and I don't think another real terms pay cut for nurses, but not just nurses, for paramedics, for physiotherapists, for anybody working in our NHS is going to help solve that staffing crisis. So I think what's important now, Kamali, is that we've got ministers who are empowered to talk about pay with unions and to listen to their own workforce. So yesterday I wrote to the Prime Minister and asked him to urgently meet with me and other union leaders. But crucially, he's got to allow his ministers to get around a table with our unions and reach a fair settlement on pay. What their fair settlement is going to look like, I can't say, and I can't negotiate live on your programme this morning, but we really do need to have those negotiations.
But you suggest that you want it to be above inflation, and inflation's running at, what, 10.7% right now?
Yeah, but as I say, it's not my job to negotiate the pay of our nurses or paramedics or anybody else. What I'm saying is those workers, very clearly, and I was on those picket lines with the paramedics just before Christmas, each and every one of those workers told me they can't afford another year of a real terms pay cut. The reality is their mortgages are going up, their food bills are going up, their rent and mortgages are going up. The only thing that isn't going up is their wages. And I think the government has to take some responsibility here now, step up to the plate, facilitate those talks. Let's get a fair pay settlement for our NHS workers, but indeed public sector workers right across the piece.
And you've asked for a meeting with the Prime Minister. You sent the letter, what, today, when you're expecting a response, and what do you think he will say to you?
Well, I would hope you would recognise the urgency of a meeting. And just to say, I mean, during the pandemic, the TUC worked very closely with Rishi Sunak in developing the furlough scheme alongside the CBI. It seems that the Prime Minister has forgotten some of those basic lessons from the pandemic, that actually we come up with better solutions when we work together. And, you know, the NHS staffing crisis isn't going to solve itself. Neither is the staffing crisis in other parts of our public services. 1 in 6 new teachers leaves the profession within a year of qualifying. There is something wrong with our public services, and that's what happens when you have a decade of underfunding, understaffing and real terms pay cuts for public sector workers.
I mean, you say he's forgotten some of the principles. What do you think he's forgotten?
I think he's forgotten the value of sitting down and reaching an agreement and taking ideas from people outside his own cabinet. And frankly, you know, I think it'd be really good for Rishi Sunak to talk to our unions, but also to talk to some of those frontline paramedics, those physiotherapists, the teachers in classrooms, civil servants, people who for the last decade have been placed under real pressures on workload, who feel at breaking point. Let the Prime Minister talk to those workers and understand their concerns and their issues. I think that's what any decent employer would do. And as someone responsible for the employment of millions of public sector workers, that's exactly what the Prime Minister should do as well.
And of course, the government will say that there are pay offers on the table for nurses, there are pay offers on the table for some of the other people who are out on strike. So this is not a case of them not listening. This is a case of unions trying to demand even more that's unaffordable at this point.
It's not a case of unions demanding the unaffordable. Politics is all about choices, and the government has got some big, clear choices in front of us. In front of it. It could, for example, decide to tax more heavily the excess profits of the oil and gas companies. It could decide to tax wealth in the same way it taxes incomes. But the reality is, each and every single one of our public sector workers at the moment faces a real terms pay cut. And that comes on the back of a decade of pay cuts. The average nurse, £4,000 a year, worse off than if their pay would have risen by the rate of inflation since 2008. Something has got to give, and I think the Prime Minister needs to listen to his own workforce.
Let's talk a little bit more about nurses then, because you brought them up again. You say something's got to give. Now, as I said, they're asking for 5% above RPI. Now, when they asked for that back in the summer, I think it was going to run about 14% would be the payoff. And now, as we know, it's around about 19%. Do you think that might be a misstep in their strategy? And would you like to see them come back with a different demand?
Listen, the dynamics always change in a pay negotiation once you're sat round a table. But what we've got at the moment is, for example, Steve Barclay, just before Christmas, our health secretary, in the midst of a dispute around pay, has said he'll talk to our unions about anything other than pay. I just don't think that's tenable.
Well,
and the only way you
can pay review boards who deal with that.
Listen, the government has been using the independent review bodies as a human shield, and I think is in real danger of discrediting those bodies. When those bodies met and made their recommendations, we didn't have inflation running at 10-11%. The government, in its evidence to those pay review bodies, set the very clear financial parameters that the bodies could work within. So, listen, Let's not hide behind the pay review bodies. What we need is the government to sit round the table with our unions and reach an agreement.
I mean, there are serious calls here, Paul, and some accusations as well that perhaps the government is not being entirely fair in these negotiations. Now, you want to have a meeting with the Prime Minister about this. Are you going to tell him that you think he's sabotaging the negotiations, that they're not being fair?
Well, absolutely. I mean, I'll say to the Prime Minister directly what I'd say to you this morning. And, you know, the key thing for me, I'm not interested in political point scoring. I'm not interested in meeting the Prime Minister just for, you know, tea and sympathy or indeed beer and sandwiches. I'm interested in meeting the Prime Minister. Our unions are interested in meeting the Prime Minister so we can resolve these disputes and put pay in the pockets of hard-working public service workers and deliver the public services that the people of this country deserve. And the public's verdict is pretty clear. 2/3 of the public blame the government for mishandling these strikes. It's time for the government to listen to the public, listen to its own workforce, get round the table with unions.
And while many, of course, will accept those calls by the public sector workers, there is a real hit to the economy by some of these strikes, of course not with nurses' strikes, but with the train driver strikes and the train worker strikes. Some £2.5 billion lost to the economy. I mean, as the country's saying that it can't afford to raise wages, it can't afford to deal with the loss to income that it's getting from these strike action.
Well, there's a real hypocrisy here because every single day of strike action, while rail workers are losing pay, the government is effectively underwriting the losses of the privatised train companies. That makes no financial sense whatsoever. And you know, the thing that really sucks demand out of local economies is when rail workers or indeed nurses, teachers, supermarket workers don't have money in their pockets to spend in local shops and restaurants. Now, our rail unions are very clear. They want those disputes resolved. They want their members back to work. They regret any impact on the economy. But the responsibility for these strikes, the responsibility for the strikes in the public sector lies very clearly with the government.
I mean, that regret is, of course, truly felt. But these strikes are going on. I spoke to Mick Lynch yesterday. He said they could run on for months to come. He's got a mandate up until May. You'll know that many mandates run until well into the new year. How do you expect these strikes to continue? Because the strike action so far has not had anything like the effect you'd like it to have on the government making those decisions.
Well, I think it's had a very clear impact on public opinion. And I know, I know talking to people who walked past that picket line in Waterloo a couple of weeks ago, the public are very clear when it comes to a straight fight between Rishi Sunak, Jeremy Hunt and Steve Barclay and our nurses and paramedics. I know where public sympathy lies. I would like the government to listen to the concerns of their own workforces. Forget me, forget union leaders. Think about the millions of people, day in, day out, who deliver our public services. The least the government could do is show them the respect of listening to them, talking to them and reaching agreement with them.
And if they don't, you're not in a general strike yet, but there are consecutive days of action. It feels like, almost like a general strike. Is that where you go to next? How do you increase the pressure?
Well, you know, it's a really difficult decision for any worker who takes strike action. They do lose pay. They don't get to deliver the services that they're proud to deliver. So my responsibility, the responsibility of our unions, is when members take that difficult decision, we have to make sure that that action is as impactful as possible and as effective as possible. So we're always talking to our unions about how we make sure we maximise the impact of industrial action, how we maximise the call on the government. I don't want to be in a position, least of all our public sector workers don't want to be in a position where people are taking strike action. But really, the ball is in the government's court. They need to talk to their own workforce. We've seen employers right across the private sector where workers have taken industrial action, listen to their own workforces and reach agreements, and I'd urge the government to do the same.
So there can be more coordination. You want to see more pressure being put forward?
Well, I think it absolutely makes sense, for example, in education and in health, where you've got a number of different unions, for unions to talk to each other about how we support each other, coordinate our action. That makes absolute sense to me.
Let's be clear on what you're saying here. Support each other and coordinate action. That means going out on the same day, all out on strike.
No, it doesn't necessarily mean that at all, Kamali. I mean, it may actually be better to have a focus for particular groups of workers on particular days. And, you know, what I'm really interested in is not posturing or grand strategising. What I'm really interested in is getting a resolution for public sector workers. And, you know, as I say, I would urge the Prime Minister to talk to our unions and talk to those frontline workers, because I think they deserve the respect of being listened to and their concerns taken on board.
Is there a concern? Is there a danger in this action? And if it does increase in ways that you're describing, that the government try and push through some more of those anti-strike laws? And I know that I'm sure that will be something you discuss with the Prime Minister as well if you get that meeting.
I mean, that is a real danger. I think it would be a real mistake from the government, because what that would be doing is treating the symptoms of the strikes rather than the underlying causes, which is those real terms pay cuts. But let me be absolutely clear, if the Prime Minister brings forward more legislation to make it even more difficult for workers to take strike action, the TUC will fight that. We'll fight that politically. We'll fight it legally as well. We already have a legal challenge in with the government. 11 TUC unions challenging the government's decision to allow employers to use agency workers to break strikes. We think the government will be very close to a breach in fundamental international labour law, and we'd ask them to step back from that brink. And rather than messing around with the right to strike, what they should be doing is negotiating settlement of these disputes and delivering a fair pay rise for public sector workers.
OK. Paul Novak from TUC, I do appreciate your time this morning. Thank you very much for coming in. All right, let's take a look at what's on the front page of the morning's newspapers. Now, we'll start with the front page of The Telegraph, which looks ahead to Rishi Sunak's speech today when he's expected to outline his vision for the future of Britain, including making students do maths until the age of 18. That's also the top story in The Times newspaper. The Guardian has doctors accusing the PM of being delusional after he denied that the NHS was in crisis. Where's Rishi? Asks the Daily Star, while the Daily Mirror pitched the last 5 Conservative Prime Ministers with the headline, "They broke the NHS." The Daily Mail, meanwhile, has a warning from Tory MPs not to return to what they call face mask madness after health officials advise people who are unwell with cold and flu to wear one. Now, the Prime Minister will announce plans later to make it compulsory for all students in England to study some form of maths until they are 18. Against the backdrop of strikes, increasing pressure in the NHS and the continuing cost of living crisis, Mr Sunak will set out his priorities for the year ahead in a speech this afternoon. Well, for more on this, let's bring in our political correspondent, Tamara Cohen. So, Tamara, good morning to you. Let's get into what Rishi Sunak is expected to say later and what we've already heard he may well say in the papers this morning.
That's right. So we haven't heard a great deal from Rishi Sunak over the last few weeks, and we're told by Number 10 this is the first time he's going to be setting out his priorities for the year in detail. This is what he wants to achieve as Prime Minister, and certainly plenty of Conservative MPs would like to see him not just buffeted by events, but setting out more of what his vision is. And the bit we've been told about today is that he wants, and this is a promise dating back to his leadership contest in the summer, all children at school to learn maths until the age of 18, because currently only about half of pupils over the age of 16 carry on with maths. He wants all of them to do some form of maths, not necessarily an A-level, it may be a different qualification, and that will start in this Parliament within the next 2 years to be completed in the next Parliament. And he says it's crucial to equip young people for the jobs of the future. And he'll talk about his own education. Of course, he went to an elite public school and say that it was that education and the privilege of having that which allowed him to succeed, and he wants that for everybody, and that numeracy. Of course, in many other countries, children have to study maths until the age of 18, most countries, in fact. So this is what he's going to set out. But I think the speech is going to range more widely than that. And certainly, if he doesn't address it himself, which I'm sure he will, the NHS, strikes, all the issues that are making life difficult for many people at the moment, he will get plenty of questions on it because, of course, the accusation is that he has not been saying very much during these NHS strikes. What is his plan for sorting out these terrible delays and these terrible scenes we're seeing at hospitals? So certainly, he's going to be under pressure to say something about that. Labour say this whole speech has been rushed forward because Keir Starmer is giving a big speech tomorrow, and therefore this is coming sort of rushed together before that. Number 10 told me that it has been ready to go for a while, but certainly I think Rishi Sunak is now going to have to tell people a bit more about what he's about and what he wants to achieve, and we'll see whether it's overshadowed by questions about whether the country is failing to function at the moment.
Okay, tomorrow for now, thank you. All right, well, still to come on the programme. We'll hear from the Resolution Foundation over new research that's found that people with disabilities are more likely to struggle to heat their home and afford food than the rest of the population. I'll be joined by the Director of Policy at Carers UK to discuss whether more investment in social care could help ease pressure on the NHS. And at just after 8, I'll be joined by Labour's Mental Health Minister and Doctor, Rosina Allen-Khan, as a total of 19 trusts around the country declare critical incidents. Now, the government says it's confident the NHS does have the funding it needs to cope with the huge pressures it faces this winter, as several trusts and ambulance services declare critical incidents. The Health Secretary has blamed a surge in COVID and flu for what he called particular pressures over Christmas rather than underfunding. Now, health leaders say they've never been more concerned about the standards of acute care in hospitals, and that's before nurses and paramedics go on strike again later this month. Katerina Vitozzi reports.
Even when there's an entire healthcare system under pressure, individual stories can still shock.
As well as being ill, it was complete and utter misery.
That's your chemotherapy tablets.
Edward Denmark has blood cancer. It makes him extremely vulnerable to colds and flu, so he tries to stay isolated. But last week he got an infection and needed emergency treatment. He says his local hospital's acute ward was chaos.
It was very packed, as it always is. And again, I can't sit on the chairs with the people. So they either put us in the store cupboard. There's like a store cupboard there. We either sit in there, but on this occasion, the store cupboard was locked or something.
He ended up in a corridor, not being seen for hours, delirious with fever and frightened about catching another infection.
I shouldn't say this, but I thought, is this fight worth it? What am I fighting for here? If I feel unwell now, I think, what have I got to go through before I can get the antibiotics in me?
The NHS trust that treated Edward told us that, like across the health service, it's seeing unprecedented demand for emergency care, that staff are doing all they can to see the sickest patients first.
Everybody's finding it very, very difficult, and it's not at all what people go into healthcare for. It's awful waiting. If you're ill, if you're worried about it, it's absolutely dreadful, even if that condition isn't getting worse, which sometimes it is. It's just an unacceptable service.
And that's out of a person's mouth who has got more experience than anyone sitting in government now. If the government don't listen to her, they're not going to listen to anyone.
But the government says it is listening and responding.
There's been particular pressures over Christmas because we've had a surge in flu cases, COVID cases, and also a lot of concern around strep A. We're putting more funding in, we've got more clinicians, we've got more staff working in the NHS. Of course, there's a range of factors that we need to do.
But so far, these reassurances aren't enough to prevent more planned strike action or make current patients feel safe. Katerina Vitozzi, Sky News.
Now, food prices soared to a record rate in December, with some households skipping meals to save money. Well, let's bring in our political correspondent, Mari Aurora, who's at Sky News Centre for us. Mari, good morning to you. So tell us about food prices. They're still going up.
Well, unfortunately, we've got quite a stark level of figures coming out of the British Retail Consortium this morning. So not good news for shoppers. We've got 13%. We've got a food inflation at 13.3%. You can see there from the British Retail Consortium. That's actually up 1.1% from last month. That's also the highest inflation rate in that category on record. So really, really squeezing household incomes. Then if we turn to fresh food inflation, that's even higher. That's gone up to 15%, which is a 0.7% increase on last month again. And again, that is a record-breaking inflation rate for that food category as well. Now, potentially a silver lining is the shop price inflation, which has actually fallen slightly. It's fallen 0.1% down to 7.3% here. So that potentially is some level of hope. But nonetheless, inflation and food inflation is still massively, massively high, which is very, very difficult for households at the moment. And especially this is going to disproportionately affect lower income households who are obviously going to be spending more of their daily salaries, their monthly salaries on essentials like food and energy. Now, it's important to think, OK, why is this happening? Well, energy prices are high at the moment because of the knock-on effect on the war in Ukraine. Also, the war in Ukraine is impacting the price of animal feed and fertiliser as well. So it's all making it more expensive to not just ship out the food, but actually produce it in the first place. But also, At the moment, inflation is so high, even if perhaps it is falling, household incomes are not going to see the benefit until it falls much more drastically. And that politically is a bit of a difficult situation for Rishi Sunak. The government are very much hoping and banking on inflation falling as soon as possible so that they can essentially try and get back round the table with striking workers and say, here we are, inflation's coming down like we said it would, and therefore now strikes are no longer necessary and we can find a deal. But until that happens, households all across the country are really going to feel the pinch. They're going to find it very, very difficult. And if we have any very, very cold snaps coming up in January and February, they're going to end up spending more money again on energy, which is going to squeeze them even further.
OK, Mari, for now, thanks for that. Right, let's take a look at some of today's other headlines now. And in the United States, the Republican leader, Kevin McCarthy, has repeatedly failed in his bid to be elected Speaker of the US House of Representatives. He needed 218 votes, but only got 203 in 2 rounds. The third ballot was even worse when he lost 20 votes. Now, the House is due to return today. Several countries have called for a UN Security Council meeting after Israel's new far-right National Security Minister, Itamar Ben-Gvir, visited the Al-Aqsa Mosque in Jerusalem yesterday, angering Palestinians. Mr Ben-Gvir has long called for greater Jewish access to the site. His visit has been described by Palestinians as provocative. 2 men charged with the murder of footballer Cody Fisher will appear in court later today. The 23-year-old died on Boxing Day after being stabbed on the dance floor of a nightclub in Birmingham. 21-year-old Cami Carpenter and Remy Gordon, who is 22, have been remanded in custody. The founder of the cryptocurrency exchange FTX has pleaded not guilty to stealing billions of dollars of his customers' money. After the collapse of his crypto empire in November, Sam Bankman-Fried was arrested in the Bahamas and extradited to the United States. If convicted of all charges, he could face 115 years in prison. The actor Jeremy Renner has thanked fans for their kind words in a social media post from his hospital bed 2 days after being seriously injured in an accident near his home in the US. The 51-year-old said that he was too messed up to type as he shared a picture on his official Instagram page. And Tom Curran, the designer behind some of the country's most recognisable products, has died at the age of 96. Curran was the brains behind that thing, the Rally Chopper and the 3-wheeled Bond Bug, that one, and the popular children's game Marble Run. He died on New Year's Eve, surrounded by his family. Now, Russia's defence ministry has said that 89 Russian servicemen were killed in a Ukrainian missile attack against its forces. Russia had previously acknowledged dozens of its soldiers were killed when 4 US-made HIMARS rockets targeted a building in the occupied town of Makivka on Monday. The ministry said that the main reason for the attack was the unauthorised use of mobile phones by its soldiers, which allowed Ukrainian forces to target the barracks. Last night, Ukraine's president urged his troops to press forward in the battle.
There is no doubt that today's bosses of Russia will gather all they can to try to reverse the battlefield situation or at least delay their defeat. We must derail that Russian scenario, and we are getting ready for it. The terrorists must lose. Any attempted offensive they launch must fail. That will be the final defeat of the terrorist state.
All right, well, it's time now for a look at what the weather has in store.
Warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
The mild and unsettled weather will continue this week with some flooding possible in some places. It's a mostly mild and windy start with a scattering of showers, but early rain over southeast England and northern Scotland is clearing. Expect a good deal of dry weather through the morning with some sunshine, but there'll be blustery showers around too. They'll mostly affect Ireland, Northern Ireland, southern Scotland and northern England.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, still to come, we'll hear from the Resolution Foundation over new research that's found people with disabilities are more likely to struggle to heat their home and afford food than the rest of the population. Hello and welcome back. Our top stories now. This morning, the new head of the Trades Union Congress has called for an urgent meeting with the Prime Minister to try and end the strikes that are causing disruption across the country. As the PM sets out new plans for all pupils in England to study maths in some form until they are 18. Food prices hit a record high in December, putting further pressure on household budgets. Now, earlier I spoke to the General Secretary of the TUC, Paul Novak, who has written to the PM to ask for an urgent meeting to try and resolve the continuing wave of industrial action. This was his message for Rishi Sunak.
I'll say to the Prime Minister directly what I'd say to you this morning. And, you know, the key thing for me, I'm not interested in political point scoring. I'm not interested in meeting the Prime Minister just for, you know, tea and sympathy or indeed beer and sandwiches. I'm interested in meeting the Prime Minister. Our unions are interested in meeting the Prime Minister so we can resolve these disputes and put pay in the pockets of hard-working public service workers and deliver the public services that the people of this country deserve. And the public's verdict is pretty clear. 2/3 of the public blame the government for mishandling these strikes. It's time for the government to listen to the public, listen to its own workforce, get round the table with unions.
Paul Novak speaking to me earlier. Now, people with disabilities are more likely to struggle to heat their homes and buy food when compared to the rest of the population. Research published by the Resolution Foundation has found a disability income gap is continuing to contribute to increasing deprivation. Joining me now is Charlie McCurdy, economist at the Resolution Foundation, a think tank focused on improving living standards. Charlie McCurdy, good morning to you and thank you so much for being with us. So just explain to us some of the data that you guys were able to pull out of this.
Hi, Kamali. Thanks for having me. So I guess the first thing to say is that disability is just a bigger part of 21st century Britain than it was in the past. Around a quarter of the working age population report having a disability, so it's clearly a big and really important thing. Not only that, and in context of the cost of living crisis, people with disabilities tend to face additional costs of living, and that could relate to specialist machinery, but also more money spent on heating if they sort of lack in mobility. So what this means in terms of the cost of living crisis is that people with disabilities are particularly vulnerable to fast rising prices of essentials.
Yeah, and is it right that people with disabilities tend to have less disposable income, and what's sort of the average earning as well? Has that been factored into the research that you've done?
Yeah, so the research has really focused on a few different things, one of which is income, and the sort of headline finding there is that people with disabilities are, partly because of the fact that they face a much higher cost of living than the rest of the population, they're more likely to be poor than the rest of the population. So we find around a third of disabled people are in the lowest income households. So there are also really big income gaps of about 44% in terms of typical incomes for disabled people compared to the rest of the population. All of this means that people with disabilities went into the current crisis with really weak living standards. And, if you've got low incomes, it means that you're going to be less likely to be able to afford common items like heating your home and food.
And Charlie, the government do make some provision available for people with disabilities to get help. But is that provision sufficient? I guess by your research, it's not.
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of important things to consider when talking about the sort of government provision that is already available and what more work should be done. So, it's definitely very welcome that the government is repeating the disability cost of living payment this year. And also the government has committed to increasing, uprating disability benefit in line with inflation. Both of these measures will help millions of people with disabilities in the short term. I think the sort of longer term structural problems that are highlighted in the report, and that's really big income gaps, which are sort of, in part driven by big gaps in employment rates and pay between the disabled population and the rest of the population. So much more work needs to be done to get more disabled people into work, but also to support them whilst they're in work.
And what does that work look like then, Charlie? I mean, you mentioned that it's welcome that the government have decided they're going to keep the benefits at inflation, but what more work specifically on trying to get more disabled people into the workforce does there need to be done? And in what ways can the private sector as well help in that?
Yeah, so I think prior to at least the coronavirus crisis, reducing the disability employment rate gap, which is the difference in employment rate between the disabled and the non-disabled population, was a massive priority for the government, but we seem to have lost some of that political energy, which needs to return. And I also think that it's not just about getting disabled people into work, it's about retaining them. If you look at exit rates for disabled workers compared to non-disabled workers, they're much, much higher. So it's not just about getting them into work, it's also about making sure they stay in work.
And the conversations you're having with government and stakeholders in this, I mean, how are they responding to these kind of calls? Because you say that the priority seemed to be there, but has fallen off somewhat.
Yeah, so I guess we've at least heard in the short term that these there is support being provided for people with disabilities, but it's if we think back to some of the findings from the report, not just the sort of cost of living disparities. So we find that around 1 in 3 people with disabilities, even before the current crisis, were unable to afford common goods and services. So like going on holiday, heating their home, or paying for a new washing machine. So all of this means that there's some real long-term structural challenges in terms of improving pay, improving employment rates, as I've already mentioned, increasing the longevity of employment. So there's some really big long-term challenges that the government needs to face up to.
Yeah, OK. Charlie McCurdy from the Resolution Foundation. Do appreciate your time this morning. Charlie, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Now, to some music industry news, and British artists have made history by taking a clean sweep of all the top 10 songs in the end-of-year official singles chart. It comes as the UK's recorded music consumption increased for the 8th year in a row, with annual audio streaming numbers breaking the 150 billion mark for the first time. Becky Cottrell reports.
This is singer-songwriter Tom Spate doing what he loves, making music. His is an industry that is notoriously competitive and fickle. But Tom says it has become more democratic because of how fans access artists.
I've been doing music for 10 years and releasing music for the last 7, and that's purely down to streaming, Before streaming was, on the cards, I was selling CDs for a rucksack, and now I'm, playing shows in Brazil, and that's purely down to streaming.
More people are listening to music through online platforms like Spotify and Apple Music than ever before. New figures show that amounted to more than 150 billion audio streams last year, more than double what it was 5 years ago. And for the first time, all of last year's top 10 singles, that's streamed or sold, were songs by or featuring UK artists. Tracks by Harry Styles and Ed Sheeran were the most popular. And the song Go by Cat Burns became a big hit after going viral on social media.
We're seeing, American artists wanting to collaborate with British artists more and around the world as well. We're seeing our music being used on TikTok worldwide and artists wanting to remix and be a part of British music. And I think it's fabulous.
And there's also an appetite for listening to music the way we used to, with vinyl making a big comeback. But it's new material and younger fans. Streaming and social media may have revolutionised the music industry, but it seems there is still a market for nostalgia. Becky Cottrell, Sky News.
All right, well, plenty more to come this morning on Sky News. I'll be joined by the Director of Policy at Carers UK as the NHS continues to struggle with growing pressure. Hello and welcome back. Now, the pressures on the NHS continue to grow this winter, with health leaders warning they've never been more concerned about the standards of acute care in hospitals. The Health Secretary has blamed a surge in COVID and flu for what he called particular pressures over Christmas rather than underfunding. But health bosses say it's more complex. Well, Emily Holtzhausen is the co-chair of the Care and Support Alliance and the Director of Policy at Carers UK. She joins us now from central London. Emily Holtzhausen, thanks so much for being with us this morning. Now, social care always comes up as being one of the ways to alleviate the pressure on the NHS. Just describe for us what needs to be done to social care for it to be able to do that.
Sure. It's really important that we get sustainable funding for social care. So at the moment, we've got a crisis in the amount of care that we've got provided. We've got 165,000 vacancies with care workers. So it's really hard to recruit. They're often paid less than their fellow workers in the NHS. And this is why we need a really a step change in the way that we invest in social care. Because without that social care, it's the sort of stuff that you get in the home to get you up, get you moving, keep you safe. And those are the kinds of services that so many people need coming out of hospital. And if they don't get them, it's not safe for them to leave. And that's why we've got this gridlock in the system. And it's not just older people that this affects, it affects people of working age, disabilities as well. So it's impacting on the NHS. And what's really important is if we look at this, it has knock-ons. So lots of families, for example, family members are looking at having to give up work to care. Now, that's not a long-term solution. How many people can afford to do that? And one in three NHS workers themselves are also providing unpaid care. So that's why the spokespeople and leaders are really saying if we don't sort out social care now, we don't get regular and better funding into social care, we will continue to have this issue. And for us, looking at supporting disabled and older people and their family carers in their own homes, this is absolutely critical and goes to the heart of what makes people's lives livable.
Yeah, and Emily, as you'll know, the government will say that they've invested some 2.8 billion next year and 4.7 billion the year after in social care. Obviously, that is a large amount of money, but it's not enough. How much more is needed to try and make sure the system functions adequately, properly?
Sure. Well, previous estimates have put it to around 6 to 7 billion more is needed. The real problem has come, and this settlement was slightly better than expected, but it comes on the top of historically a lot of underfunding of social care. So social care is playing catch up, if you like, with the NHS and with other services. There have been real term cuts between 2010 and 2018. And so it's not even keeping up with demand. And that's a real problem. And as I said, social care is absolutely essential for people's daily lives to be able to do the things like even leave the house, to get out of bed, to help eat. Those are really essential services that people need in their lives.
And of course, governments, previous administrations to this have known the importance of fixing social care. I seem to remember a previous Prime Minister on the steps of number 10 saying that was a priority for her. So why do you think it is that we're still at this point now where people like you are telling us how much more is needed and it still seems that it's not being done?
You're absolutely right. This is an issue that we've seen coming for a very long time, and NHS leaders have also been saying that we need to invest more in social care. And I'm sorry to say that investment just hasn't happened. There've been many discussions about how to fund it in different ways, whilst meanwhile we have to go on with social care not getting the support that they need. We've seen things like day centres closing up and down the country for working age disabled people, but as well for older people, and local charities come under a lot of pressure. So the political will has to be there. Once that is there, and we are fortunate to have a chancellor who understands much more about social care, and this is something that really still needs to be a priority and in his inbox to make sure that we get the funding that we need.
Now, you say there's some 165,000 vacancies in the sector. Does paying people who work in social care mean that you're going to get more people coming into the industry? Because don't there need to be an increase or improving in the way that people work within social care as well? Because I'm not sure that it's a sector that many people think about going into.
Absolutely. I mean, social care could be a fantastic and rewarding job, and there are many brilliant people who do some great things within social care. But yes, it is about pay. They are paid less than people within the NHS. There's comparisons done with supermarket workers, for example. And so it's really important the government has looked at doing a workforce strategy, but we haven't yet seen that strategy. And our view is that that needs to be for the Care and Support Alliance. Needs to be very closely aligned for the health NHS workforce strategy, because otherwise the NHS will take from social care, and then we're still with this problem. So pay, terms and conditions, and alignment with NHS workers is really the way that we need to go for social care, to see this as an absolutely essential service for people.
And what conversations are being had with ministers then, Emily, to try and make sure that the message is getting through to government about this?
Well, there were regular conversations going on with government, and it's just really, it's so important that they understand that this is an issue. I mean, because social care is so diverse and so different, people don't always label this as social care in their own private lives, if you see what I mean. They might talk about a care worker or a care home, or my disabled son with autism and learning disability needs this particular help. All of that is social care, and all of it is essential. There's regular dialogue with ministers, and things like the hospital discharge fund that was announced, which was 500 million, which was announced last September, was very welcome. But services could have done with that in the summer. So what we need to see is these kinds of funds. We have got a slightly more assured settlement going forward into next year for things like hospital discharge need to come early enough so that services, whether they're NHS, social care, or charities who provide these services, are able to plan in time.
And as you mentioned, Emily, social care is a wide sector. There are lots of different parts that go into it. But I wonder if you can give us an idea of how a person working in the sector is feeling right now, seeing all these pressures, hearing their industry being talked about a lot as being the way to alleviate the pressures on the NHS. I mean, how are people who work within this industry that's really giving a very humble feeling right now?
Well, I would say that care workers have quite often felt quite invisible. There's always a lot of talk about the NHS because the NHS, of course, is so important to us. They often feel forgotten and unheard. They need to understand that they're a really valued sector. I think what they want to see more improvements themselves. It can be really tough because when you get shortages of staff, then quite often people are even more stretched. And we've got a lot of people going in above and beyond, and yet are on minimum wage or just above. And it's something that we need to value this as a really important sector. And it's not just the workers within it, it's the disabled people and older people themselves who really need to be sure that they are able to get a good quality services, and families too, who want their relatives to live the best life they can, but also be safe in their lives too.
Okay, Emily Holtzhausen, co-chair of Care and Support Alliance. Thanks very much for your time this morning.
Thank you.
Now, some other news making headlines this morning, and millions of pounds have been given to programmes across England and Wales to support children affected by domestic abuse. The support announced by the Safeguarding Minister sets aside £7 million for early intervention strategies to prevent violence against women and girls, while £10 million will go to organisations that provide counselling and one-to-one support for survivors. More than 1 million people overpaid for their prescriptions last year, according to data by moneysavingexpert.com. These people would have saved money with a prescription prepayment certificate, which is also known as a prescription season ticket. That ticket costs £108.10 for unlimited prescriptions for 12 months. Niagara Falls has been lit up in blue in support of the Buffalo Bills player Damar Hamlin, who suffered cardiac arrest on the field yesterday. The NFL game that he was playing in against the Bengals was suspended, and Hamlin remains in hospital in a critical condition. All right, just time now this hour for a look at the weather.
warm memories wherever you go. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
Well, the mild and unsettled theme will continue this week with local flooding possible. It's a mostly mild and windy start with a scattering of showers, but early rain over southeast England and northern Scotland is clearing. Expect a good deal of dry weather through the morning with some sunshine, but there'll be further blustery showers around. They'll mostly affect Northern Ireland, southern Scotland and northern England, with just a few for other parts of the north and west.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
All right, now before we start the next hour of our news programme, let's take you through some of the pictures that we've seen in the papers this morning that have caught our eye. And there's this one from London Zoo. It's count-up time for the animals at London's Zoo, just near Regent's Park. That blackboard is being cuddled by those Sumatran tiger cubs. The meerkats were counted too, and this one was eager to do some maths with the keeper. There's the meerkat, that was a tiger for. And the stock take of every animal is required as part of the zoo's licence, as well as all other British zoos too. So those animals having to do extra maths, just like the Prime Minister wants us all to do.